So, Cliff, Fire Will Come by Oliver Laxe.
Yeah, I loved this film. I really thought it was great. You know, I have seen his as you know, I've seen his previous two films, Mimosas and You Are All Captains, and I've really enjoyed those films. And so I came into this with quite high expectations actually, and I wasn't disappointed. I mean, it is a strange film. It's not, it's not an easy film to watch always, in the sense of that it's got periods which are very slow and not a lot happens. But I thought the structure of the film was really interesting because it really starts with a bang. It's like action film that filled at the start with that scene with the bulldozers knocking the trees down, and you at first you just see the trees falling, and it's really spectacular because they're falling in an odd way. They're not being chopped down. Yeah, they're just kind of falling down so quickly, and there's something really just, it grabs you by the throat, that film at the start. The noise and the light and the mist, and I just thought that was spectacular, very dramatic, very cinematic. That's a shame that we don't see that on a big screen.
Yeah.
And then it comes to this point where it kind of focuses, it suddenly goes silent. They stop pushing the trees down, and it singles out one tree, and the music's very dramatic. And so I just thought that that was an intriguing start. It kind of grabbed me right from the beginning. Then the end, obviously, is very dramatic as well. The fire is spectacular. The film, how close he gets to the flames, the way it's shot. So it's kind of bookended by this action film almost. That just is so exciting, and so and then in the middle you've got this long period of where the pace is very slow. It's very mundane things happening. There's not much development in the story. But I was always engaged. I always found it interesting. I think the thing that, because when we first meet, is his name Amador? Yeah. And when we first meet Amador, we don't really know whether he's a good guy or bad guy. And I think, I felt that we still don't know at the end of the film whether he's a good guy or bad guy. And I think that kind of ambiguity, or whether he's reformed, let's say, or whether he's capable of doing it again. And so I did find that there was always that slight tension that we didn't know if he was, if it was as innocent as it looked, or whether, something was going to happen at some point. So it did feel like there was a tension even in the slow parts. And I just found that very engaging all the way through. Kind of aesthetically, I thought there was a real journey here in texture. Obviously, a lot of this film was about water, and a lot of this film was about fire, and we really feel it. And you'll remember that I saw a screening of Mimosas at the ICA, where Oliver Laxe presented the film, and he said beforehand, I'd like you to watch this film with your skin. And it's always stuck in my memory that I often think of it, because that really made sense to me, of kind of watching a film with your skin. and I thought about that a lot in this film, because I think you could really feel the textures of this film. And there was a process, there was an evolution, a clear evolution. So although there wasn't much happening in the narrative, a lot was happening in the evolution of the texture, because we started out with, it's very wet, very green, very lush. it did actually make me think of Tarkovsky. Particularly, there were a few moments when I thought it was quite. It made me think of Stalker, particularly, but you know, it did feel like it was referencing Tarkovsky, even with the big bell as well, which is obviously in Andrei Rublev. But the film was so wet and watery and damp.
Mm.
And then we had that scene where they listened to the Leonard Cohen track, Suzanne. And it's the first kind of moment of warmth in the film, if you like. And from that point, the colors in the film change. We see more orange, more red, more yellow. And obviously, as we move towards the flame, where it becomes ultimately white, I thought there was an amazing effect in the filming of the flames, where you would get this white in the middle of the flame. And the white was so well captured that sometimes it would come and go, but sometimes it would kind of, I guess it was the way the camera's reacting to the light, but it would, there were times when it would get, the white would get quite big, and then it would get smaller, and eventually the white took over the whole screen became white. And I just thought that from, you know, that was an incredible evolution in terms of color, texture, and, you know, feeling. So it was a very visceral experience, I think. There was some things which fascinated me about this film. I did, when the bulldozers suddenly came to a stop, we'd had all this noise and the trees falling down and the noise of the engines and the music, and then it comes to a stop, and we just kind of focus on this tree, and the camera goes up the tree, looking at it. And, you know, I just wondered, it was always in my mind why it did that. And I went back and watched that again once I'd finished the film. And I don't know whether this is stretching it too far, but it did almost look like an image of Christ on the cross. There's something about the arms being out. There's something about the twisted nature of it. I did wonder whether that's what it evoked for me. And I think if that was the case, that's interesting that was just put in front of us for the whole film. I think it definitely is supposed to have some meaning, that this tree was singled out. It's like all the other trees around it were down, but there was something about this tree. I liked when they were talking about the Leonard Cohen song, that she said something like, there's no need to understand the lyrics to get the music. And, you know, and I think that actually this is quite fitting with the idea of watching a film with your skin, you know, listening to music with your skin. You don't necessarily need to be able to work it all out. And I do feel that something was happening in this film, which was beyond what, you know, something intellectual which can be talked about and thought about. This is a film definitely to be experienced. I thought that was really interesting, the conversation about the trees drying out, and, you know, this being some kind of cancer, because obviously with the trees drying out, I mean, the film did go from wet to dry on this evolution of textures. And obviously as the trees dry out, they become flammable. And so that was potentially, the cancer was maybe, you know, the potential for this crime to be repeated, you know, this arson. So I thought that was really interesting. And I really liked what the mother said. It felt very compassionate. Whatever we were supposed to feel towards Amador, I do feel that, you know, it was never judgmental. Even if he actually started the fire at the end, there was a lot of compassion for him. And the mother says, you know, that when she's talking about the trees, if the trees hurt others, they're hurt too. And I thought there was something really compassionate in that people who hurt others are hurt themselves. And
Hurt people, hurt people.
yeah, exactly. And I did wonder about the actors through the film, about whether they were professional actors or not. I know that in his previous films, I think that he's worked with not, I mean, I haven't checked it because we try not to check things before we do the review, but I think that in both his previous films, he's not working with professional actors. And I would not be surprised if that was the case here, because I thought the acting, I mean, it was almost like it had an authenticity. I was going to say it was almost like a documentary, but it wasn't a documentary. It was like a feature film, but I just found it so natural. But I noticed at the end of the film that the actors were all, it just had their names, that Amador is called Amador and Benedicta is that's her real name. And so I think, the actual, I suspect that they weren't professional actors. And I think I mean, obviously, if you don't use professional actors, there's always a risk, I guess, that it's not going to work. But it was the same in Mimosas. Mimosas is a film where it's definitely not a documentary style, or it is a feature film with a story. But the performance of the non-professional actors is extraordinary, really engaging and and interesting. And I thought that really worked here. He has a knack for getting really good performances, authentic performances out of non-professional actors. And yeah, so I really, really enjoyed it.
Cool. I didn't know his work before this, except for what you told me about Mimosas, and I knew you really enjoyed it. And of course, I knew he'd worked kind of worked with Ben Rivers when on that crazy movie Ben Rivers made, and so I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought, for some reason, I suppose because I only knew Ben Rivers' work, I thought it would be more overtly experimental than it was. But we're in agreement on this one. I really enjoyed it very much as well. Some of those sort of symbolic resonances you mentioned passed me by, but I think, and some of it is very clearly there as a sort of subtle subtext that certainly enriches the film. The thing that struck me first and probably most powerfully was, as you were saying, about the texture of the film and for much of it. I hadn't noticed that it's divided quite as clearly as you pointed out there, but certainly for a lot of the film, there is a kind of the expression I wrote down is that the landscape seems both bleak and fertile because of all that water. And that seems a fairly decent summary of the filmmaking style itself, because the style is very straightforward in some sense. It's mostly long-ish takes, though none of it felt excessive or indulgent. And yet there's a real richness to the film. This simplicity of the filmmaking style managed to carry within it this central mystery, if you like. Firstly, why did he set the fire in the first place? And then as the film went on, I started to think, well, you don't actually know for sure that he did. And we certainly don't know that he started the second fire. But above all, what I think the real mark of the film's success is that it has at its heart this conundrum that is never solved, and yet it felt above all honest. There was an honesty to the film, and I think that comes down to the simplicity and integrity of the performances that you remarked upon, and also their attitude towards the land that they work. There is a real kind of rigor and heart and empathy with the animals and with nature that at no point feels hackneyed. It didn't seem like a sort of sentimentalizing of pastoral life or anything. It felt very authentic and very honest. And I found that and the performances really compelling. As you say, there are long sequences within the film where I suppose in conventional terms, not a lot happens plot-wise, but the film is so nicely textured and so nicely performed, and it carries that central mystery so well that I found it completely captivating, and I really enjoyed all of it. Um, and this this restraint. I thought what was clever about the film is this restraint, this not revealing the mystery. At no point felt frustrating. You know, I didn't know what the answers were to these fires, but nor did I feel, in a strange way, nor did I feel like the filmmaker was holding anything back. In a strange way, I felt like I knew everything I needed to know, and that's a real feat, I think, to manage those
Yeah.
two things so successfully. And of course, that comes down to the title. The title is this kind of declarative: fire will come. And there's a kind of acceptance about that. Maybe it doesn't matter whether he started the fires or not, because fire will come.
Yeah.
And, you know, the answers are buried within the film in a way that I don't think you necessarily have to recover them or in any explicit way and say, right, let's pin this down and say who did what when. It's just, you know, the answer is there in the same way that seeds are in the ground and they will grow. You don't really have to understand how or why. Things will happen, you know. And so there's a real sort of richness to the film that is played very in a very mature and calm and careful way. And so the film unfolds really beautifully, I think. I was really moved by the Leonard Cohen as well. As I think there might have been other moments, but it was certainly the most striking moment of music that starts off diegetic. It's played in the radio, and then it kind of soaks onto the soundtrack. And I found it's hard to use Leonard Cohen, I think, in a film and not feel a bit kind of on the nose. And I think it's a mark of the film's integrity that it actually felt really moving. And I really liked it. There is certainly this sense, there is absolutely a suggestion that, yes, he started the second fire, because it comes almost immediately after he's in the bar and he's, you know, he's put his good shoes on and he's gone to the bar and he's clearly hoping to attract the vet's attention. And she comes over and he says, "Oh, they've told you about me, haven't they?"
Yeah.
And she says, "Yeah, they have." And she kind of backs away. So maybe there was this, you know, anger within him. There is the suggestion that there's an almost kind of Taxi Driver like narrative in the background there. You know, the person looking for some kind of, you know, purpose or direction in his life, some vent for pent up masculinity. But it's so quietly played that none of that ultimately is really important. I think it's enough for the film to gesture towards those answers and leave you to make your own decisions about it. So I thought it was a completely successful film, very, very engaging, really beautiful, honest. Really liked it.
Yeah. I think it's right, isn't it? That it almost makes no difference whether he did start the second fire or not. And indeed, we don't know the circumstances of the first fire, of whether he actually was guilty or not. So I don't think it makes any difference to the film if we were actually given that information. And I think that's a really interesting thing to realize, isn't it? That the film can end with not giving us the satisfaction of a definite answer, but still be wholly satisfying.
Yeah. And I think it's a real mark of maturity. I think in lesser hands, that central mystery would be the point of the film, you know, queued up in such a way that, oh, the film is all about the fact that you never really find out who did it, you know, but it's almost like the filmmaker's not too interested in that. And the other thing I forgot to say about the music, it reminded me, do you remember the Q&A we watched of that Georgian film Beginning, where the filmmaker, you know, we had very mixed feelings about that film, but the filmmaker was saying that if you move the camera so infrequently, when you do, it really draws attention to itself and feels very deliberate. And I think the film has something of that in its use of music, that if you're very sparing with it, when you do use it, it's very affecting.
Yes, yeah, there were times when I really, really enjoyed the soundtrack, because there were obvious moments when obviously the Leonard Cohen track and the Vivaldi piece, you know, the Vivaldi piece was very dramatic, but then there was also a score for the film which did at times sound a little bit like Stalker. It was very atmospheric. It was, I mean, it wasn't, it was different enough that I didn't find it a problem at all. But it really added to the atmosphere of looking across the hills with the mist, with the fields, the dampness, and at times it was very dramatic. It really created a really interesting atmosphere. I guess this film is so atmospheric, isn't it? It's not I think in some ways that's possibly why it's so successful, because the atmosphere of this film is more important than the narrative. The experience of watching this film is much more important than enjoying the story.
I agree, but I don't think they sit distinctly from each other, though. They feel very well integrated, I think. And I think it's because there's this emphasis on the landscape and the objectivity of nature, that scrutinizing the characters' motives in kind of psychological terms almost doesn't make sense, because we're so sort of inundated with natural processes that have no kind of psychology or motive. They just are,
Yeah,
which is very, in a way, a kind of interestingly Tarkovskian view of nature as well, isn't it? The poetry of it and the internal rhythms of it, which feed into the films. So that's not a parallel that occurred to me when I was watching it, but I think you're right. That's probably a very conscious allusion on the filmmaker's part.
Yes. I'd be interested to know how much script there was for this film, because in some ways, afterwards, I was thinking about, what was the name of that film we watched a couple of months ago? Was it Stop the Pounding Heart?
Stop the Pounding Heart, yeah.
Stop the Pounding Heart, yeah. It was before we started doing the reviews,
yeah,
wasn't it? But that was a film with non-professional actors, where it's not clear how much was scripted and how much was just almost documentary style, like the family speaking amongst themselves. And I think that had an authenticity. And I thought about this film, that how do you make it so authentic with people who don't have an acting training? I just think it's extraordinary to be able to pull that out. And I guess it must be, or I wonder if it is, that actually you don't give them a script. You kind of give them a description of where it's going to go, but you allow them to just find their own rhythm with it and have their own conversation. But I think at every point, the script in this film just felt really authentic. And how do you do that?
Yeah,
because it seems like that could so easily go wrong.
Yeah, I think both films are immersed in a culture that is the actors slash characters themselves are immersed in. I would imagine the actors in this film, they do live in Galicia and in those lands, and they milk those cows and build those houses, and
Yes.
and so I would imagine that's where the innate authenticity comes from. And then when you think about the dialogue, it's very spare in this film, although it doesn't feel austere. There's very little dialogue, actually. The exchanges are more kind of physical. They're people pulling cows out of the mud, and do you know what I mean? They're doing things rather than talking about things. Like the scene that really stuck with me is when his mum is making the eggs and he pulls the hot rings off the stove and heats himself a bit of bread on the side of the stove. And those are very small gestures that just add such authenticity to the film.
They do, definitely. I agree. But actually that particular incident, I thought that was really interesting, because that's where it becomes, I found that there was a moment in that I was just, relaxed watching him, play with the bread. And then he opens the fire and he starts poking in it. And you remember what he went to prison for. And I thought that was just that kind of introduced, if you like, the tension that I did always feel that was there in the film. It's so subtly done, because it wasn't like the film was overburdened with tension, but it did feel like there was just this tension and uncertainty about, you know, whether he was dangerous or not.
Yeah, but as you say, there was a compassion in not just in his mother's attitude towards him, but I think in everyone's attitude towards him. The guys who were building the house, like everyone seems to believe that yes, he certainly started the first fire.
Yeah.
But at one point, one of the police officers says in an almost comical way, like nearly burnt the whole mountain down last time. And those guys who are doing up that house, they're quite sympathetic towards him. You know, they say he passes by, they offer him a drink and he keeps walking, and they say something like, oh, he's all right, he just had a real hard time of things.
Yes.
And so there's a
Yeah.
real and even when they really lose their temper and they think he did start the second fire and they attack him, they're annoyed with him, and they do, yes, they beat him, but there's it's not like an angry mob, you know. They're not going to string him up. They're just annoyed and they've hit him, and then they feel bad for having hit him. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? There's a real humanness among these characters and a real compassion even for him that it, in some ways, both exaggerates the ambiguity, this is he a good guy or a bad guy, and almost effaces it and goes back to
Yeah.
the idea of it doesn't matter, you know.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? Because they're not beating him up because he started the fire. If he did, they're beating him up because the house was burned.
Yeah,
You know, so it was very personal. It was like they were lashing out in anger. But
yeah,
actually, you're right. That was really interestingly done. That it, even at that point, it doesn't feel like he's condemned or judged. It does feel extremely compassionate.
yeah.
Yeah.
Really
So
impressive.
we both like this film.
Yeah, there you go.
Highly recommended.
Definitely. Yeah. And next week we've got For the Time Being by Sulka Tiziana.
Lovely. Look forward to it.
Yeah.